Welcome back.
Hey, but you got to give the professor really some kudos because he showed up strong today. Of course, I gave him that shirt in Moscow, but by God, he looks terrific.
Yeah, well, thank you for inviting us. But this is Larry's cultural imperialism. In Moscow, he basically forced me to take it and now to wear
Yeah, but I'm not enforcing or threatening. You know,
it.
I'm not sending the helicopters to board you. By the way,
Uh,
let me just observe you're using a new platform other than StreamYard, and I really like it.
Yeah.
well, that's because of me. Because Streamyard, doesn't work in Iran. I think they've sanctioned Iran, or because I don't think it's from the Iranian side.
Well,
So
screw.
whenever I want to use Zoom, I have to use a VPN here. So I
Oh,
think it's blocked on the Iranian side. But StreamYard, I think it's blocked on the other side.
yeah. You got
Yeah.
get rid of StreamYard. Use this
Yes.
because you know Muhammad comes through so clear and
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
And
Let
by
me
the way, Merry Christmas to
to
your viewers, wherever they may be.
yeah,
thanks so much.
thank you.
And
Let
of
me
course,
start
yeah.
let me start, Professor Marandi, with what we've heard from the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio about Iran and how do they feel about Iran. 2 days ago, 3 days ago, he said this about Iran. Let me play it out for you.
Our problem with the Iranian regime isn't simply, I mean, obviously it's predominantly their desire to acquire nuclear weapons, their sponsorship of terrorism, but it's ultimately the treatment of their own people. I mean, I said it in my hearing a year ago in the Senate, I say it now, I know of no nation on earth where there is such a difference between a regime that governs the country and the people who live there every single day. That regime is not reflective of the people who live in Iran, who are the inheritors of a proud and long cultural legacy and a proud history. And then you've got a clerical radical regime that has driven and taken the wealth of that country and used it not to enrich secure their people and their future, not to make sure they have enough water and electricity. They've used their money to sponsor terrorist organizations all over the world. That's what they've used their money for. So we're going to continue to consistently point that out.
Professor Marandi, is that similar to someone else? Go ahead, your take on what he said.
Well, it sounds similar to Netanyahu. And of course, he is an ally of Netanyahu and deeply supportive of Netanyahu. And he also said that as long as Hamas has weapons, there won't be peace. In other words, the Israeli regime can do whatever it wants. It can massacre and slaughter. It's okay for them to have all the weapons. But if the Palestinians have anything to defend themselves or to respond to decades of Israeli ethnic cleansing and slaughter, then war and slaughter and genocide is justified. I don't think anyone. I mean, a decade ago, and a decade and a half ago, a lot of people would have taken this seriously because in the West, most people really, and in a lot in other parts of the world where Western media was very dominant, a lot of people took this very seriously. And I've traveled, I've been around, I've been in media, and the narrative on Iran that comes from the West has been very powerful. But I think in recent years it has declined. But most particularly after Gaza, things have changed. And I would also say after Ukraine to a degree, because Russian media has become, I think, more critical of the West, and they are seeing how Western narratives work on Russia, and so they appreciate more the Iranian position and how Iran is demonized. But in general, after Gaza, I think things have changed dramatically. In fact, when I go to places, I see that people are siding with Iran. In other words, they're saying, they're supporting Iran against the United States and against the West. I'm not saying this is universal, and I'm sure, especially in the United States and in the West, people are still highly They dislike Iran, or at least most people, because of decades of propaganda. But elsewhere in the global south, the mood has shifted a great deal. I haven't traveled everywhere, but in the places that I've been to, it's changed. So when he says that, he's never been to Iran, so he has no personal experience. I remember Piers Morgan, every time he would insult Iran, on two occasions I invited him to Iran, and he basically rejected my invitations and said, if I come there, you'll have me arrested and taken to, I don't know, some dungeon or something. And so, he refuses to set foot in the country to see if his ideas have any, if there's anything valid about them. But in the U.S. Secretary of State right now, we're seeing in the United States how universities are being cleansed of opposition to the Israeli regime. In Iran, you have people, you have students who speak very openly. Very few nowadays who speak openly in support of the Israeli regime. No one cares what they say. I mean, it's declined a lot, the numbers over the last 2 years. Then they never were a majority, but they were larger in number than now. But even now, they exist. But in the U.S., people lose their jobs because of such a position. I mean, they're supposed to be the good guys, and Iran is supposed to be the evil regime. And now in the UK, we see physicians being arrested for posts supporting Palestine, for using the phrase Jewish supremacy, which that's how people view Zionism. It has nothing to do with Judaism. Jews who do not believe in Zionism are not seen as supremacists, but Zionists are seen as supremacists, whether they're Jewish or Christian or Muslim or whatever. But the point is that for him to say that that Iran is this sort of society, when he's just bombed Iran, when he's just assisted the Israeli regime in carrying out genocidal strikes on civilian targets in Iran, is a bit too much.
Yeah. Larry, the other part of this interview, which wasn't in this clip, he said that Iran is one of the most sanctioned countries on earth by the United States. After more than 40 years of sanctions on Iran, and they're still trying to do everything, attacking Iran. And right now, Netanyahu is talking about, the missile program of Iran.
Mhm.
What is going on? What is the happening in the Trump administration in terms of the foreign policy toward Iran?
Well, first, let me just say how thrilled I am to be able to be on here with two dear friends. One of the beauties of the internet, Professor Morandi and I didn't know each other 2 years ago. Now we've been on these kinds of exchanges, but I've also been able to be with him in person and realize just what a joyous, decent human being he is.
The same here.
Yeah, well, thanks so much. So, one of the upsides of the internet like this is we're actually able to build new international friendships in a way that, wasn't possible 25 years ago. You might send a letter or something. So let me just say that. Look, the Trump administration's lost. They're trying to find a theme, and Trump wants, I'm the president of peace. Look at all the peace I'm bringing. Launch those bomber strikes on Venezuela. Let's blow the hell out of those boats and kill a bunch of innocent people. It just sort of seems a little contradictory, the narrative there. And in fact, they've gone from emphasizing that we're stopping the flow of drugs into the United States to now it's, oh no, we're going after all this illicit oil that Iran. And my favorite was I call it the blast from the past, where, oh my God, Iran's got all these networks throughout Central and South America. So, in the course of my work with Berg Associates, I had two other partners. We did a lot of undercover in investigations into product counterfeiting. And um, what we discovered was these Lebanese Muslim family networks that are spread from they're concentrated heavily in the Cologne Free Trade Zone. One of the biggest families, the Wakeds, Abdul Waked, and his son Nadal. Nadal was head of the Cologne Free Trade Zone at one point. They've got massive duty-free shops throughout Central South America, and they've been involved with money laundering. But you find that it's not just that. I mean, there are literally dozens of these family networks, and they find them in Panama, Isla Margarita, which is off the coast of Venezuela, Maicao, Colombia. It sounds like a place in China, but it's this wild west town up in the northeast corner of Colombia that is the smuggling gateway into primarily Bogota, Medellin, where they have these incredible black markets. Then it goes down to Ciudad del Este, the tri-border area where Panama, Paraguay, Argentina come together. And then over in Chile, Iquique. Now, the United States has always tried to pretend this is a terrorist network. These people are pure capitalists, okay? They care about making money. And the fact that it's not, that they're not some group of these anti-Jewish fanatics. I recall one occasion where we were, myself and another former member of DEA, were conducting an audit of a Jewish-owned business in the Cologne Free Trade Zone. It's called El Triunfo. And the owner, Jose Menachet, I could talk about him now because he's dead. But, he got jammed up where the U.S. Embassy was going to pull his passport because they thought he was involved with drug trafficking. And, he was a little round man, fat. It looked like a bowling ball with feet. Okay. Or as they say in Spanish, una sandía con patas, a watermelon with feet. And his heart surgeon, his heart doctor was in New York City. And by God, he had to travel to the United States to see that heart doctor. And so in desperation, he opened his books and we went in to evaluate it. So one day, I'd been hearing from the Panamanian lawyers who were Latinos about, oh man, these Muslims, boy, in the Cologne Free Trade Zone, they're crazy. Man, they tried to, they put up 40-foot containers when the U.S. invaded. They were prepared to attack and destroy the Americans. And so there we are, we're in Jose Menachet's shop, and he's putting together these gift baskets. And I said, what are you doing? He says, oh, it's going to be Eid soon, and I'm preparing gift baskets for my neighbors. And I said, they're Muslim? Yeah. And I said, why are you doing that? He goes, oh, back when the Americans invaded Panama, we were so terrified that all the local Panamanians were going to loot us and steal all of our stuff that, he said, my Muslim neighbors were the only ones that had firearms. So they sealed off the city and protected us. So I'm going, yeah, this Muslim Jewish hatred, boy, it's rampant there throughout Central and South America. It's not. But I go into this long anecdote just to illustrate that the propaganda that's put out by Washington, D.C., without understanding a damn thing about how that whole region, what you've got throughout Central and South America are family networks. These people may be, they are Muslim. Some of them are practicing, some of them aren't, but they're first and foremost families. And these family networks, they intermarry, and so it goes from Cologne in the north down to Iquique and Ciudad del Este in the south, and stretches across the ocean into Africa. it's something the West just doesn't understand. And so this sort of what I see the Trump administration trying to do is just play off of people's fears in order to try to gin up this hatred to justify some very evil policies.
Yeah. Uh, Professor Marandi, let me bring you up for. We know that the supreme leader of Iran recently said that if we compromise on the nuclear program of Iran, they're going to talk about the missile program. They're going to talk about the human rights, free speech, all of that. This is little by little coming to the getting closer to to do regime change in Iran, so-called regime change in Iran. In your opinion, with what's going on, we've learned that Netanyahu is asking Donald Trump to bomb Iran. How do you find it? Do you think it's some sort of new rhetoric? Because when you look at the basically those media who are influenced by the Israeli government, who are trying to put everything, Israel gonna attack Iran any moment. What is your take on what's happening?
I don't think that the Israeli regime would attack Iran if it was thinking reasonably,
Mhm.
because ultimately Iran would come out on top. And the best chance that they actually had was during the 12-day war when they carried out that blitzkrieg attack. Now Iran is much more prepared. Iran is working on its intelligence gathering, internal security, and its anti-drone capabilities have improved extensively. Anti-air defenses, meaning against aircraft, is something that they're working on. Of course, it takes a lot more time and a lot more work to get where they want. But when it comes to missiles, I think that the Iranians are expanding their underground bases, and also I think that they're also expanding, from what I hear. I don't know this from any uh, source inside the government, but from what I'm hearing online, is that they've expanded the range of their missiles, and I think that means that they will be launching also missiles from the east of Iran, which will make it much more difficult for the Israeli regime or the Americans, because they'd have to fly much further westwards or northwards to be able to target any of these places. So if there's another war, I think that it will be much worse for the Israeli regime. But the problem with Netanyahu and his fanatical allies is that their needs are not necessarily the needs of the Israeli regime. I personally, while in the West it is often said that the Israelis have won their wars, I think that the Israelis have really been the biggest losers in all this. The only place where they had any real success was when Netanyahu and Erdogan and Biden together overthrew the Syrian government. That was a major success. But in Lebanon, I don't see them achieving any victory. In Yemen, they were definitely defeated. In Iraq, they've not been able to do anything. Just, I think, yesterday, a senior official from Hamas, or a delegation from Hamas, went to Iraq and met one of the Popular Mobilization Forces lead commanders and thanked them for their support. Iraq today is in a stronger position to support the Palestinians than it was before the elections, because the pro-resistance factions increased their seats considerably, and they'll probably be a decisive voice in choosing the cabinet and the prime minister. So I don't see, in the war with Iran, the Israelis, I think it's clear that they failed. So I don't see this another war as being something that will benefit the regime. I think it'll be worse. But I think Netanyahu, his calculations are more about Netanyahu, and the calculations of his wife are more about her own needs. And she, of course, has huge influence on Netanyahu. So there is a possibility that they would attack. But I think it won't go well. If the Americans get involved, uh, you know, things will get out of control. We saw that the Americans carried out a limited strike on Iran, and the Iranians struck back, struck their base in Qatar, destroyed their radar systems, costing probably billions of dollars. But if the Americans want to get seriously involved, then I have no doubt, and I've said this many times before, that the Iranians will take out everything in the Persian Gulf because American bases are on all of these countries. So that would bring down the global economy, and it would be a catastrophe for all. But that would be Iran's response to some a war waged by the United States. So no matter how I look at it, it's not logical for the regime to attack, but that doesn't mean it won't.
Yeah.
Larry, your take on that?
Well, no, I agree with the professor. You've got this disconnect between the rhetoric and the actual military capability. So as we saw with what happened in the Red Sea with the Houthis, Trump's basic line was, "Man, that Biden administration, they're a bunch of wimps. We're gonna show these Houthis who's the boss." So, what do they find out? Well, those Houthis are tough little bastards. Man, you can't. Everything we tried to do to weaken and destroy them, they just kept coming back. It's like the Energizer Bunny. And but boy, were they able to step up the rate of taking down these predator drones. Previously they were shooting down about one a month. Well, they upped it to about one a week, and at $35 million a piece. That's that's pretty expensive. And then the threats that were presented to the U.S. ships. So the U.S. had to withdraw. What strikes me, and I'd be interested in what the professor is seeing, is the sort of the culmination of pressure, economic pressure on Iran, came to a head back in 2015 with the signing of the JCPOA. Because at that time, both China and Russia were going with the West. Yeah, let's put that pressure on these Iranians. Now, where are we? Well, with the snapback sanctions, and I still don't understand why they call them snapback, because my understanding is they never took them off. How can you snap something back that's still been there all along? That's the first absurdity. But now both Russia and China are fed up with all the nonsense and the threats and the bullying coming out of Washington and out of Europe. So when that snapback were announced, Russia and China both made a point. We're not doing this anymore. So I view that created an economic opening now for Iran that didn't exist 2 years ago, and that now they've got the collaboration with both Russian and Chinese, and I think even India, that there's sort of an economic light at the end of the tunnel for Iran that didn't exist 2 years ago. And so all of this attempt by the West to use its economic might to pressure Iran they're finding out that power has eroded. And I think if you could get Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin off to the side and have a private chat, they'd both be probably pretty surprised as well that it has turned out this way, that their efforts to try to break free of Western hegemony, and particularly in the economic realm, it's actually starting to work. And it's working in a way that is actually terrifying the West. So I think we've got to recognize also the fundamental change that took place in Iran in the aftermath, on June 25th, after the 12-day war ended, that previous efforts by the Iranian leadership to keep the Russians and Chinese at arm's length, that went away. They've been there's a number of Iranian officials, both with the foreign ministry and defense ministry, they've been racking up some frequent flyer miles getting back and forth to Moscow and to Beijing. So I'd be interested, Professor, what your observations have been.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct that the difference between now and 2015 is enormous. Back then, Russia and China were much weaker countries.
Mm-hmm.
Russia was recovering in the middle of its growth, but it still hadn't got where it is today. And the Russians and the Chinese weren't facing sanctions. So working with Iran would have been costly, and pressure from the United States was also costly. So what the Russians and the Chinese would do at the UN Security Council was that they'd water down the sanctions or the UN Security Council resolutions, but they wouldn't stand up against the United States. That gradually began to change, but I think the biggest shift took place after the beginning of the war in Ukraine, because the divide between the Russians and the West became enormous, and so the Iranians and the Russians moved much closer. And of course, we know that Iranian, from Western accounts, let's say, Iranian drones have played a very important role in the war between uh, the proxy war between NATO and Russia. And so the relationship began to improve much more rapidly. The same is true with China, especially after President Raisi came to power. Iran, he traveled both to Moscow, he traveled to Beijing, and also Iran joined BRICS as well as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So under his presidency, Iran began to decrease the focus on the West and focus more on the global South, Russia, China, and major powers in the global majority. Militarily, that's true as well. I think that the Iranians and the Russians today are working closer. The Iranians and the Chinese are working closer. I think the 12-day war has also been something of concern to the Chinese. After the 12-day war, they are more invested in containing the United States, just like in Ukraine. The Chinese know that, and so do the Iranians. They know that if the Russians fail in Ukraine, then NATO will advance.
Yeah.
In the case of Iran, it will literally advance next door, because alongside Ukraine, they wanted to have Georgia in Ukraine as well, and then after Georgia would be Armenia and Azerbaijan. So Russian failure for Iran was not
Yeah.
acceptable. For the Chinese, not acceptable, because the Chinese knew that at the end of the day, the number one priority and the number one enemy for Western elites is China. So China began to tilt closer towards Iran even more after the 12-day war. In a sense, over the last few years, the United States and the Europeans have been very successful in pushing different countries together. And
Yep.
Iran, Russia, China, among others, are among those countries. The same is true with India. The United States has been cultivating the relationship with India for many decades, for at least a couple of decades, and now all of a sudden, the behavior of the United States has pushed India towards Russia, towards China, and obviously Iran would benefit from this as well. We saw the images of the Indian Prime Minister and the Russian and Chinese presidents smiling together in China. So I think that today it's much different. Iran is selling. Iran, after President Raisi became the president, began to sell its oil. Under the previous administration, the Rouhani administration, Iran was selling very little oil. So Iran began to sell its oil at discounted prices. Gradually, its exports grew, the discounts decreased. And then by the time he passed away in the helicopter crash, Iran was selling all of its oil. It was at full capacity and no longer giving any major discounts. Now Iran's under the Pezeshkian administration, this is continuing. In fact, Iran's oil production is growing, and we're seeing the beginning of something very important in Iran, very important, which is not being discussed, and that is energy reforms. Iran is giving huge subsidies for gasoline and electricity and natural gas. So, for example, in Iran, gasoline is roughly 1 cent a liter, which is unbelievable.
Yeah.
But of course, it causes excess consumption. It de-incentivizes people to conserve, and also it creates a huge incentive for smuggling. Now the government is beginning to reform that and decrease the subsidy. It's still dirt cheap, but this is the beginning of a process. And if they continue down this road, then the government will be able to spend a lot more money on developing the country rather than spending it on subsidies. So this is a difficult time for Iran, but the world is in transition. Iran is selling its oil. Iran has trading partners. A decade ago, during the JCPOA, as Larry was alluding to, Iran was very isolated. The Russians were afraid to touch Iran. Companies were afraid to work with Iran. The same is true with China. But now, after the trade war and after the 12-day war, the Chinese think very differently. The Russians, of course, they're sanctioned like Iran, so neither side really cares what the West thinks. And Russian oil companies, which the Americans are forcing out of other countries, now they're investing in Iran. So 2, 3, 4 years down the road, with the north-south transport corridor completed, you're going to see Iran as a hub for Russian oil and gas, most probably, gradually. Russian exports and imports will go through Iran, Russian oil and gas investments, and more increasingly Chinese investments. So it won't, the situation in Iran won't change tomorrow, but I think 2, 3, 4 years down the road, as the US continues to decline and the global south becomes more assertive, I think the impact of US sanctions, as Larry has alluded to, which is already melting, it will melt even much further.
Larry, I think what is happening, what you've mentioned and Professor Morandi has mentioned, is the way that the war in Ukraine, you remember when the war in Ukraine started, China
Right.
was somehow so cautious in supporting Russia. Today, they're not cautious. They're
Right.
just putting out their policy. They're supporting Russia. And with the case of, Iran was somehow, they were more cautious than before the war between Iran and Israel, 12-day war. They didn't want to go that far against Israel. But you see today the foreign minister of Iran says they're ready. If Israel attacks, they're ready to just respond to Israel. These countries were so cautious in their sort of manner toward the United States and Israel. You don't see that happening right now when it comes to Russia, China with the trade war, and Iran with the war between Iran and Israel. I don't know if that's appreciated with the foreign policy of the United States and the Trump's policies.
Well, I think there's been a tendency on the part of the leaders in China, Russia, Iran, and it's not just them. I've seen it in other countries. Um, let me take you back over 20 years ago. I was an instructor in a program that was put on by the U.S. State Department's Office Anti-Terrorism Assistance Training Program. I used to be the deputy director of that program. But since I'd left state, I was now back teaching it. I would do the section on terrorist trends and the human rights issues, basically encouraging countries, don't torture, ignore what we do, but don't torture, that kind of thing. And um, this was like around the time of 2003, 2004. And uh, I can show you, here, let me show you. Just stand by for a second. Okay. as you can see the flags of all these different countries. And so I wasn't just one isolated country. And they kept coming up to me and said, "Okay, tell us what's the real deal with the war in Iraq?" What they assumed that the United States was lying to them, that we had some secret master plan that we were following, and because that's sort of how they thought. And I had said, no, 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 trust me, there's no plan. Or if there is, it's been very, very poorly executed. I think there's always been this tendency, particularly in Russia, China, and Iran, to overestimate the capability of the United States, and to think that they're actually working very methodically on some secret plan, whereas they're malevolent, they're malicious, and they don't have the best interests of either Russia, China, or Iran at stake. But sort of the good news in that is that they are, you know, they're reacting sort of moment to moment. So what has happened over the course of the last 44 months since the start of the special military operation is the growing realization, particularly in Russia and China, that the United States is not quite as formidable as they thought. And it's like that scene, I'll take you back to the old movie, The Wizard of Oz, with Judy Garland. And at the end, when the dog Toto runs up to this booth and pulls the curtain back and pay no attention to that man behind the screen, they're projecting this great and powerful Oz. But it turned out it was just, drunken former, evangelical pastor that was pulling all the levers behind the curtains. And that's sort of what we got now. So with Russia and China discovering, hey, we can stand up to the United States, and particularly if we cooperate, we're better off than if, before they were holding us hostage. They were threatening us. They were bullying us. And the same with Iran. The United States declared Iran is the number one terrorist state in the world. Yet, which country was behind more assassinations in the other country? Well, that would be the United States, by far. In fact, Iran, to my knowledge, has not assassinated a single person in the United States or elsewhere. That's been the technique of the West. And so we get this projection where we put onto Iran and China and Russia the very things that we're doing. And now that is getting exposed. And there's some chaos now inherent in U.S. foreign policy, where you see Rubio saying what he says, but then when it comes to actual action, they're running into what I call the limits of power. And we have seen now, and especially over the last 18 months, there is an acceleration in the development of the BRICS infrastructure that's creating not just a new economic model for the world, but it's also creating a new political model.
Professor Marandi, I think what we can say about this situation with Iran and Israel in the Middle East is, what is the record? Look at the last 2 years of the situation in Gaza. Look at what's going on between Israel and Lebanon. Even the war between Iran and Israel, you see Israelis mostly killing civilians in Iran by terrorist attacks, but Iran hitting the strategic targets in Israel. But when you look at the mainstream media, they're so powerful in the way that they're trying to to convince the public opinion all around the world that these players, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, these are terrorists, and Israel is the good guy in this game.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree, but I don't think they have the degree of success that they used to have. I remember during the 12-day war, someone sent me a link of a song and the number of people who'd watched it and liked it, and it was like it was about Iran strikes on Tel Aviv and Israel, and the popular support for Iran across the global South was enormous. Whereas Iran in the past was always demonized. For me, it was something new because I was always defending Iran during these years, saying, look, Iran is not that evil, abnormal society that you're being told it is. But, you know, during the last couple of years, and especially after the war, it's been the exact opposite. In fact, you see people online, young people on Twitter and elsewhere, uh, responding to mainstream media, whether it's on Gaza or Lebanon or Iran or Venezuela. I mean, right now, across the world, sympathies are for the Venezuelans. People are not buying the story, and as Larry said, the story keeps changing too. First, it was drugs, then it was now it's oil. Now it's the U.S. oil and U.S. land and U.S. assets that they have to return. It's been evolving and people see it, even though um, these social media companies are shadow banning like they do with my account, my Twitter account. They shut down my Facebook and Instagram account years ago, but they shadow ban, they shut down accounts. They boost pro-Israeli or pro, uh, war accounts when it comes to Venezuela or Iran or Lebanon, but it still doesn't work. And in fact, I think in the long run, and Larry probably, I mean, definitely could give a better response than but my view is that this is only making things worse because people in the United States are now blaming the Israelis for lack of freedom at home. In other words, the censorship is having an impact, but the impact is not exactly what they want it to be. In other words, in the past, they were protesting against the genocide and their tax dollars being used for a genocide. Now they're angry because they can't protest anymore. And it's not because of something that's happening inside the United States or inside the UK or inside France, but it's because of something that's happening in another part of the world. So I think that their ability to mobilize public opinion against Iran is very limited. In the global South or the global majority, it's not working. In the West, I think it's more complicated than before. But but I you know but I think people are beginning to recognize that the United States only sanctions countries that are independent. They don't sanction Turkey. They don't sanction Saudi Arabia. They don't sanction Mexico. They don't sanction. They only sanction Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua. They only sanction Iran, in the past Syria, Lebanon, Yemen. Why? Because they oppose their policies, because they oppose genocide. Other countries live in without sanctions, although many of them are not doing all that well economically, for a host of reasons. But they don't have sanctions because they abide by U.S. policy. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, they don't have elections. Both of them are Wahhabi states. Mohammed bin Salman has distanced the country away from Wahhabism, which is a good thing. But traditionally, Wahhabism has been coming from Saudi Arabia. And now Qatar has taken they're the most important country in supporting these extremist groups. The number one mosque in Doha is the Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab Mosque. So it is a Wahhabi country. And the ideology of ISIS and Al Qaeda and Boko Haram and the misery that you see in Somalia and it comes from there. And then the Emirates is doing its own thing, supporting genocidal groups in Sudan and a lot of the dirty money that's laundered across the region, Afghan drug money, it all goes through the Emirates. So U.S. allies, and there are no elections in the Emirates. There are no elections in Qatar. There are no elections in Saudi Arabia. There are no elections in other U.S. allies across our region, where there are token elections, they're not real elections. These are countries where the people support the Palestinians, but the governments are cooperating with the Israeli regime. So, when the U.S. government attacks Iran nowadays, people see through it. Again, there's a segment of U.S. society, older Americans who've been living through decades of propaganda, but the younger Americans think differently. I'm not saying that in the United States Iran is popular, but I'm saying that their views on the world are evolving. And so I don't think that legacy media has the influence it had before.
Yeah.
Although I should point out that alternative media is not necessarily all a good thing. The powers that exist, the billionaires, are now taking over alternative media too. They're banning accounts, they're limiting the ability for others to be seen, and they're funding their own accounts. But still, we live in a very different world today than we did 3 years ago.
Larry, here is what we've learned from the Israeli media. Yedioth Ahronoth, one of the largest, outlets in Israel, they're talking about that Iran's ballistic missile production capacity could reach up to 3,000 per month if Israel doesn't take action.
Hmm.
What is that?
Yeah.
What does that mean, Larry? What sort of action do they want to take?
Well, wait. I thought Trump obliterated Iran. I mean, we kicked Iran's ass so bad they're not going to get up for years. So, this is look. The narratives, the shifting narratives. They're now trying. This is a propaganda effort to try to create a foundation for justifying a new attack, but they're not there yet. Actually, we see this hypocrisy on display, and I don't know if you're Dave Chappelle, the comedian. He just did a show on Saturday night, and he was commenting on the fact that the Zionists had been attacking him because he went to Saudi Arabia and took that Muslim money and putting on a show. How dare he? Because the Saudis murdered Jamal Khashoggi. And then Chappelle Chappelle really has a gift for this. He goes, I didn't hear the same complaints when Israel's been killing 240 journalists. And he says, I guess that this one just was somehow more important. But he was pointing out immediately what the hypocrisy was on the part of the West. And there is a real split that has developed in the conservative circles here in the United States. If you saw, the Charlie Kirk's organization put on this American festival called I'm Fest. And 1 minute, Ben Shapiro, this Zionist cretin, is out just, ripping up Candace Owens, ripping up Tucker Carlson, who, congratulations to Tucker Carlson, he was named Anti-Semite of the Year. Yeah, the fact that these crazed Zionists think that by attacking Tucker Carlson in that way, that's going to build support to destroy Tucker, is having the opposite effect. It's like building Tucker's power and making him more influential, not less. But the Shapiro comes out and he attacks Tucker, Candace, and Megyn Kelly. And Megan's sort of I'll call her a borderline Zionist. I love Israel. But boy, she was offended. And she said, I thought we were friends. We ain't now, no more. So it's a real divide. And that's not going away. And the fact that the Zionist crowd out of Tel Aviv, both the Jewish element and the Christian element, they're alarmed because they recognize that the narrative of the the David versus Goliath. And notice that Hollywood's put out a new animated David movie. David is such a blonde, blue-haired boy, and so gentle, and kill that nasty Arab giant. It's just more propaganda, and the Americans are, a growing number of Americans are no longer buying it, and that's created a real problem for both the Trump administration, but more importantly for the Netanyahu administration, because they are desperately trying to buy influence with people, put influencers out there at $7,000 a pop. And we've learned now how penetrated the U.S. government is, particularly the FBI. I don't know if you saw this one clip that was circulating of Dan Bongino, the deputy head, the number 2 guy in the FBI. And in this podcaster, I don't know who it was, but she was, what cause is closest to your heart? Israel. It's like, oh my God, please, enough. Between Kash Patel and Dan Bongino, this whole Israel first mentality that's been imprinted on the Trump administration, it's running into some trouble because the growing majority of Americans, particularly under the age of 35, they ain't buying it.
Yeah. Larry, I think the case of Charlie Kirk is getting so much, even with the new information coming out, and they say that somehow the FBI was covering up something, they're trying to do.
I'll tell you exactly what I think they're covering up. I think the FBI had information that there was a planned hit by Israel on Charlie Kirk, and that they failed to stop it. And then their goal after it was to cover it up, just like they tried to, the U.S. government covered up the attack by Israel on the USS Liberty. I think the circumstantial evidence that points to it is enormous. And the story that this kid, Tyler Robinson, who had never been to this university before, who had never, he hadn't scoped it out in advance. And I can't emphasize enough that if you're going to carry out, an assassination attempt on somebody using a long distance rifle, you have got to know where they're going to be seated, and you got to know the distance from where you're going to be shooting to that target, because where you aim the rifle, it varies where the bullet will hit depending on the distance. Because, bullets travel in an arc. They don't travel in a straight line. They follow the curvature of the earth. And so,
especially if you're at a different height.
Yes.
You're at the top of a building.
So this is the story we're told is that, this kid just he was upset about the Charlie's comments about transgenders, and by God, he was going to get justice for his partner, whatever she it was, and that he grabbed his grandfather's rifle and then just I guess picked up some spare ammunition and then headed off to the campus to see if he could find a place to take a shot. This story has so many damn holes in it.
A shot which should have blown his head off.
Yeah. I mean, if it was the round, the 30-06 that they claimed, that's a devastating bullet that would have passed completely through the neck, severed, at least half severed the head, if not fully severed it. That didn't happen. So, but my point is, there is this, enormous effort to pressure to try to shut down Candace Owens, and she makes some mistakes in what she says, but her overall instincts are exactly correct. And the curtain's been pulled back on the Zionists that have been working the machine behind the curtain, and they're getting exposed. And that's created a problem for Netanyahu. That's creating a problem for the future of Israel, and it's creating a problem for Trump.
and you have simultaneously Epstein.
Oh, who?
Yeah.
N- Nothing to see here. Here, let me show you. I've got. I actually I have one of the documents that was released.
It
Yeah.
looks authentic.
Yeah. Oh, God, you know the try. There's nothing to see here. Well, if there's nothing to see here, why do you have all that blacked out? You know, I mean, if there's nothing there, why hide it? You know, expose it, put it out there. That'll prove that Trump is innocent of this. That Trump had nothing to do with this, and that Epstein was not an asset of Mossad and working with the CIA, because the fact that Epstein was tied into the arms purchases through Maxwell in the 1980s for the Contras, right away that tells you there was a tie with the CIA.
Yeah. Professor Marandi, on Larry, you as well. On Saturday, I talked with Dr. Michael Rechtenwald. He has started a movement in August 2025. It's called AZAPAC, Anti-Israel, America PAC. And he feels, Professor Man, it's not something that created from outside of the United States. In the United States, you see the people who voted for Democrats, they're just getting separated because of what's going on in Gaza, basically, and with the case of Israel. And you see, as Larry just mentioned, you see at TPUSA, they're talking about, a faction, a important faction of the Republican Party. They're thinking differently about the Israel and the support of the United States to Israel. And do you think that you said how Iran has changed, Russia has changed, China has changed. How do you see the United States and the changes that are happening in the United States?
I don't think I never thought I would see this sort of change in my lifetime. I mean, I have no position on Mamdani himself. Maybe he'll be another Obama. Maybe he'll be something half decent. Maybe he'll be decent. I don't know. But the fact that so many young Jews voted for him, I think, is itself a major and significant sign. It shows that it's not just Christian Americans or secular Americans or Muslims. It is Americans from different religious backgrounds, different racial and ethnic backgrounds that are turning against the Israeli regime. And Larry would know this much better than I because I live in Iran. But I always saw Israel as having a very clear hold over U.S. public opinion,
Yeah.
always. And I never thought this would change. But the changes that we're seeing now in the United States and in Europe and across Europe, but in the United States, the United States is of particular importance because it's the most important power by far in the West. So you do see this huge awakening among young people, and a lot of the key activists have been Jews. A lot of the shows like your own show that are very critical of the Israeli regime are either run by young Jews or Jews are involved in electronic intifada. You have Jews working there. The gray zone, Max and Aaron Matei, Max Blumenthal, Aaron Matei. You have Katie Halper. You have a host of Jewish Americans speaking out against this regime, and their voices are now carrying much more weight than 3-4 years ago. So, and I think that just shows, first of all, uh, uh, how morally decent young Americans are when they get real information. Their opinions evolve, and that's why I think that the last 2 and some years has been catastrophic for the Israeli regime. I believe that they are the big losers in all this. I mean, all those countries that have been complicit, that have sold oil or transported oil or did business as usual or buying gas. They've all failed, morally speaking, in our region, or those who have embassies and do trade, or those who went to Egypt and Sharm el Sheikh. I think all of them are complicit, but I think still the Israeli regime is the big loser in all this, and their supporters are the big losers. It's uh, people are shy about, and many people are shy about even giving I mean, in Iran, as I said, 3 years ago, I can't give numbers. I don't, because it's anecdotal. But you had a group of, you'd have students who would attack the Palestinians, and they didn't have any historical knowledge. But they were, a lot of it was just in opposition to the government. If the Iranian government was supporting the Palestinians, they thought otherwise. But after what we saw during the last 2 years, their numbers have dwindled dramatically. So this is a huge loss for Netanyahu. It is a huge loss for Zionism. It is a huge loss for AIPAC and all those. And the very fact that you see Tucker Carlson, as Larry was saying, coming and becoming the most important person in U.S. Media. And now Candace Owens, who has an even larger audience than his, despite the fact that sometimes she says things that don't seem very credible, but on the whole, her argument is pretty straightforward. She's showing the inconsistencies in the FBI's account, and it just, that account it's not true. It can't be true. It doesn't, that things, their claims don't make sense. So she's becoming more important, and then uh, you're seeing this, on the Democrat side, among independents, young people, they've all turned, they've largely turned against the regime. That, I think, is all welcome news. It may not show, it may not have, it may not change things fundamentally in the near future, but I think if you look down the road, this is very bad for Zionism.
Yeah.
Larry, before wrapping up, what is your understanding of, Professor Marandi just described how he feels, how he thinks about the situation in the United States. But when it comes to you, you live there, you
Yeah.
see everything there. What is your take on that?
Well, actually, looking back, especially over the last 60 years, I go back, let's say 65 years, I mark it to the release of the movie Exodus, which starred Paul Newman. And uh, that was really the first big uh, mythologization of Israel as, tiny little David fighting against this Goliath of evil Arabs and Muslims. Um, and he actually was fascinating about they actually acknowledged some of the terrorist roots of Israel in that movie. They had characters that played that were locked away like for the Irgun. Um, I think that there's been an active propaganda campaign on the part of Israel that goes back quite a while to portray Muslims as villains, and the Jews, but it's really Zionists because, as Professor Morandi correctly noted, you've got a lot of people who profess Judaism or acknowledge their Jewish roots that are speaking out against Israel. And he mentioned Max Blumenthal and Aaron Mate, Jeffrey Sachs. But when you look at what does the Islamic religion, doesn't matter whether it's Sunni or Shia, what does it say about Jesus? What does it say about his mother Mary? It is respectful. It recognizes Jesus as a prophet. It exalts his mother Mary. I think she's she is actually mentioned in a way that no other woman in Islamic history is mentioned. And whereas you come
A
to
chapter of the Quran is named after her.
yeah, so you know but yet that's hidden from Christians, and we've seen this now in the wake of this attack on Bondi Beach in Australia, which I am increasingly beginning to believe that Mossad is playing a direct role in helping carry out such attacks in order to further poison the atmosphere and make the West anti-Muslim, even though and I come back to Russia. We've seen in Russia that Russia is a dominant, it is a Christian nation. Its foundation is Christianity. Its history 1,000 years ago, Christian. But it is not fixated on this anti-Muslim theology. In fact, the Muslims that live in Russia are patriots, like Abdi Aludinov in particular. But it's not just with him, Kadyrov. And even with the past history of the intense civil war that took place in Chechnya more than 16 years ago. So Russia doesn't fall into that trap. Whereas in the West, we're seeing just this flood of information about why we got to hate these Muslims and love us some Zionists. I mean, it's really despicable. And that, the success of that narrative has fallen apart now. And that's what has Netanyahu and his crowd terrified, because no matter how much they just brought 1,000 evangelical pastors to Israel. Hey, all expenses paid trip. And, I guarantee you several of those pastors were offered sexual opportunities as part of the tourist package that they freely partook of. But in order to try to shape Christian congregations to hate Iran, hate Muslims in general, and love them some Israel. Yet, when you get into the Talmud, and the several ardent Zionists have become, they're aware of this, so they're trying to cover it up. But the references to Jesus, the mother of Jesus, Mary, as a whore, as a prostitute, and Jesus is burning in a pot of excrement. They try to suggest, oh, that wasn't really about Jesus. That was about some other guy who just happened to be named Jesus. Oh, okay. But like I said, this whole propaganda narrative is coming apart, and it's unleashing the equivalent of what I'd call a political earthquake in the United States.
Thank you so much, Professor Marandi and Larry, for being with us today. It was a great pleasure to have you.
I want to thank the professor for his style choice.
Yeah.
Well, as Larry said at the beginning of the show, this was Larry's personal gift to me in Moscow, and I was waiting for an opportunity to wear it. So thanks to Nima, the three of us are wearing similar shirts. But I would like to congratulate everyone on Christmas. Of course, in Iran, Christmas is celebrated on January the 6th because most Iranian Christians are Armenian. And of course, the Orthodox, if I'm not mistaken, is January the 7th. But in any case, this whole next couple of weeks, it's a celebratory season. And I congratulate Larry, yourself, myself. Jesus, as Larry pointed out, is for Muslims and Shia Muslims in particular, an infallible prophet. And we believe at the end of time he returns. So when they speak about Judo-Christian values, that's fine. Or you can have Judo-Muslim values, that's fine. But to negate Muslim and Christian, the values, how they come together and how similar they are, and the most striking, of course, is Saint Mary, and of course, so many Iranians and Iraqi Popular Mobilization Forces people and Hezbollah, they died fighting for Christian neighborhoods in Iraq, Christian areas in Syria, and Christian parts of Lebanon. And of course the Yazidis as well, who are of course a different religion. But in any case, my congratulations to everyone, and I hope everyone has an excellent holiday season.
Look at him spreading propaganda that Iran allows Christians and Jews. I mean, we all know from the U.S. intelligence community that they were all eliminated.
Well, Larry, this is cultural imperialism.
Yeah.
I got this from you.
Yeah. Well, I always, Professor Morandi is an important voice of reason, and I wish you continued great health and to continue into the new year doing what you do. You play an important role in helping educate the world, and I think
You too, Larry. Thank you. You too.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right,
Bye-bye.
guys.